Everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today for another GIN North America webinar. I am Dina Baptiste, a member of the GIN North America Steering Committee, and I will be your moderator for today. Now, before we get started, allow me to share with you a note about GIN North America. We are a regional community of the larger Guidelines International Network that includes members from Canada, Mexico, and the United States. These webinars are just one of the ways we facilitate sharing and collaboration in our regional community. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with past webinars, can be accessed on the GIN YouTube channel in about a week or so. Please share this information with others who may miss today's live session. If you are not a member of GIN, we encourage you to visit the GIN website for more information on the benefits of membership. Also, if you are a GIN member, please, and you have not already done so, please sign up on GIN Connect, as this is the platform we primarily used for communication, and it is a great source for the latest news in the guidelines community and resources for GIN members. Just a very important reminder for everyone, this year the Guidelines International Network Conference will be a joint conference with Cochrane JVI and the Campbell Collaboration. The Global Evidence Summit is scheduled for September 10th in Prague. Abstracts and workshop submissions are now open and will close on February 21st. So there's plenty of time to submit. So we encourage you, if you're on today, please spread the word and submit an abstract. Conference registration opens on the 7th, so please make a note of the conference webpage for registration and additional meeting information. Now, today's webinar is part 2 in a series of webinars on race and racism consideration for clinical practice guideline development that the GIN North America community initiated about over a year ago. If you missed part 1, the recording is available on the GIN YouTube channel. Again, note that this session is being recorded. All participants should be on mute to facilitate a smooth recording. But just in case, please check that your audio is on mute before the presenters start. We have allotted time for questions at the end, so we ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A section, and the speakers will respond to as many as possible after all the presentations. Now, today we have 7 speakers joining us to discuss their work, their research and work. So I will give each of them a quick introduction. First, we will hear from Tiffany Duque, who is a global health professional and currently serves as Cochrane Senior Officer in charge of the U.S. network that includes 23 affiliate centers in the U.S. as well as Cochrane's 53 country offices. She has more than 20 years of experience in public health program design, implementation, program management, and collaboration here in the U.S. and internationally. Next, we will hear from Rania Ali, a research public health analyst at RTI International. Rania's expertise is in systematic reviews and evaluating and implementing chronic disease qualitative and mixed methods research, and is particularly passionate about addressing health disparities and promoting health equity, focusing on Dr. Patricia Hain, who is a professor at in gerontological research and rehabilitation medicine. Dr. Hain's expertise in evidence synthesis methodologies, including pioneering meta-analysis on exercise training effects in individuals with dementia. Her research acumen is equally matched by her commitment to diversity and inclusivity, demonstrated through her design of research projects and scientific training programs for both culturally attuned, inclusive, and equitable. Our next speaker will be Dr. Damian Francis, who is an assistant professor and director of the Center for Health and Social Issues at Georgia College and State University. His research work focuses on systematic reviews addressing methodologic issues such as health equity and evidence synthesis and complex public health questions such as diet and disease risk. Next, we will hear from Dr. Vivian Welch, who is editor-in-chief of the Campbell at the University of Ottawa School of Public Health, Epidemiology and Public Health. Also joining us is Neela Satay, who is a program manager at RTI's Evidence to Practice program. Her research interests include stakeholder engagement in systematic reviews and review methodology. Lastly, we will hear from Dr. Meera Viswanathan, Cochrane affiliate, who currently serves as the director of RTI's University of North Carolina Evidence-Based Practice Center. And in addition to her stellar track record of systematic reviews for the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force and professional societies, she is a leader in developing novel methods and tools for guidance related to evidence synthesis, including today's topic on centering racial health equity and evidence synthesis. And a special thank you to Dr. Viswanathan for pulling her colleagues together today for this webinar. The speakers and myself have no relevant financial conflict of our intellectual conflicts of interest to disclose, so we will now go into our webinar session.
Hi, everybody. I am Tiffany. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dina and GIN North America, thank you for hosting us. We're very excited to be here. I know I'm the first presenter, but Meera, did you want to do the agenda and stuff first, or? Okay, go ahead. So next slide, please. We have no conflicts of interest, and this work was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Next. So here's our agenda. I'm going to give a brief overview and rationale of our project. We'll then have Rania talk about our listening exercises. And then Patricia will give a review of the definitions work that her project team has worked on. Next, we'll hear from Damian Francis, who will give us a review of logic models and frameworks. Then we'll hear from Vivian Welch, who will talk about review of methods and interventions. Then we'll hear from Neela Satay on review of interest holder participation in reviews. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Meera on our next steps. And I just want to note quickly that throughout the presentation, we will be using interest holder, which represents stakeholder. We have changed our use of stakeholder to be more inclusive and equitable. So it's just when you see interest holder, that's what it means. Next. So I will give us a background and overview of the Cochrane US network and rationale for the project. So this project came through the Cochrane US network to our project team. So I'll just give everyone a little bit of background on the US network. Next. So the US network was founded in 2019. That is certainly not to say there was not Cochrane work going on in the United States for many years before that, I think starting in 1994, I believe. But in 2019, it was decided that a network structure would be much better for facilitating collaboration and transparency. So we currently have 23 member groups in the United States. We have affiliate institutions. We have review groups, which are topical. We have fields, which are also topical, but mostly focused on dissemination. And we have some associate centers. So we have a mix of universities, professional societies, and organizations. Next. So some of the objectives of the Cochrane US Network and some of our activities include what you see here in the circles. So we certainly advocate for Cochrane's evidence and any high quality evidence. We influence guidelines, recommendations, and policies, specifically in the United States, but also times our groups are involved in global work through Cochrane. We enhance trust in science and evidence, as very important given the infodemic and mis and disinformation, especially in the United States. We do a lot of dissemination and knowledge translation. That might be the bulk of what a lot of our groups do. We peer review, author, and prioritize reviews, and we are the group that informs Cochrane Global of what the priorities in our region are. Next. Just some background on our Robert Wood Johnson racial health equity background. So key ingredients. As we all recall, there was a moment of racial reckoning in 2020, the George Floyd tragedy and other things. And 2020 was a tumultuous year for many reasons. This was relatively new. As I said, the US network was founded in 2019. So we had a new group ready to collaborate on projects and look for something to do. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a special interest in racial equity in the United States. So the foundational premise of this project was that race is not biology, it's racism that leads to biological consequences. And systematic reviews and other primary research routinely ignore or treat race as a biological variable. Next. So here's some project details, and this is a picture of a number of us at the Cochrane Colloquium in London. We had the opportunity to present a number of times on different facets of this project, which was great to see each other in person. So as I said, this is one of the first projects funded to the Cochrane US Network. I can keep going. And this was a long coming. We had 3 years of conversations with Robert Wood Johnson, with some of our colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control, and with Drew Riddle, who's one of our co-chairs at the Cochrane US Network. I can pull mine up if you're not able to reshare it.
No, I can share it.
Okay, perfect. I have it here too. I have it. Do you want to share? Or oh, perfect, great, thank you. So, as I said, this was a 3-year in the making project, and we were so excited when it got funded, as it serves as kind of a pilot for the Cochrane US Network and organizing 23 different centers, understanding who's available, who are experts in the topic, who have availability and interest. We were funded from September 2022 to August 2023. We had a no-cost extension, which just finished with our submission of 7 manuscripts to JCE, which we were excited about. It funds multiple institutions and partners of the Cochrane US Network, and you'll hear from some of those people who represent those institutions. And its interest holder engagement was reflected in the genesis, staffing, and focus of the project to make sure that we were meeting the interests of the project. Next. So the objective of the study is to identify what is needed to center racial health equity in systematic reviews. And our guiding principles are to build on existing knowledge, be inclusive, create a sense of shared ownership, and embed equity within the conduct of the project while creating opportunities for junior investigators and minoritized investigators, as well as compensating our contributors fairly. Next. Here's an overview of the makeup of our groups. So we have a steering committee and advisory board, a number of great people from CDC and Cornell and University of Ottawa, Cochrane. And then we moved to Drew, who was our grantee at Texas Christian University and is our PI and sign off. I'm the project manager and also helped do some research on task 1. And then we have Ana Pizarro, who's the project coordinator and researcher on task 1 and 2. So task 1 was listening exercises, which you'll get to hear more from Rania. Task 2 was 4 separate systematic reviews, definitions, frameworks, methods and interventions, and stakeholder engagement, which you'll also get to hear from all 4 of those project heads. And then prioritization exercise, which we'll hear from Mira about. Next. Okay, that's it for me. So I'll hand it over to Rania and get to the details of our projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiffany. So now I'll just delve into the high-level insights from the listening exercises. You can move to the next slide. Thank you. We sought to inform new guidance on the processes, methods, analyses, and dissemination of reviews that center racial health equity by conducting a series of listening exercises with diverse interest holders, and that included patients, community representatives, systematic reviewers, clinicians, guideline developers, primary researchers, and end users such as funders and policymakers. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the methods, we conducted one-on-one interviews with 29 interest holders between January and April of 2023. We employed standard qualitative methodology to identify themes that aligned with the key question priorities of the study. Next slide, please. Through iterative analyses, themes emerged that responded to the following questions around racial health equity definitions and frameworks, scoping considerations, teaming structure and inclusion of patients, systematic review questions, evidence and methods, reporting standards, translation of evidence, training and sustainability, measuring success, and critical next steps. Next slide, please. So now I'll move on to key themes that emerged from the listening exercises. I divided the key themes into broad domains that mapped to our key questions. So firstly, in the first box, you'll see interest holders supported centering racial health equity in systematic reviews, particularly for conditions where racial disparities are documented. Systematic review respondents noted the importance of integrating racial health equity across the entire review process from inception to dissemination. Secondly, when defining and conceptualizing racial health equity, interest holders raised issues of systems and power, injustice, social determinants, and intersectionality. However, many interest holders were unaware of frameworks specific to racial health equity for systematic reviews. Thirdly, themes emerged around scoping a review. So interest holders noted the importance of the review will influence the extent to which it should center racial health equity. So for instance, reviews of effectiveness or behavioral interventions require a focus on equity, particularly when addressing aspects such as access and adherence and implementation that efficacy or biological interventions may not. Fourth, interest holders noted that the purpose of the review will influence the extent to which it should center racial health equity. And then in terms of team makeup, it should compose a research team that expands multiple disciplines. So this may include health equity, policy, lived experience, and community-based research. And then fifth, key themes emerged around patients' roles in systematic reviews, with interest holders recommended having representatives from affected communities, including people with the health conditions that are being explored in the review, and lived experience of racism on the review team to ensure that the right questions are asked. And then in the last bullet, you'll see interest holders had recommendations around the types of questions, methods, and evidence to use to center racial health equity in systematic reviews. So when selecting systematic review questions, interest holders highlighted prioritizing topics based on equity issues. In terms of evidence, interest holders emphasized that addressing racial health equity requires broadening the evidence types in systematic reviews to include non-randomized study types, because RCTs do not often address the implementation and access issues that can lead to racial health disparities. Next slide, please. And then seventh, interest holders suggested adapting review methods to include racial health equity considerations and key questions, searches, and outcomes, meaning having questions explicitly on racial health equity, including racial health equity in the search terms, and having racial health equity as an outcome. In the 8th bubble, you see themes emerge around translation of reviews into practice, with interest holders noting that to impact implementation, one must consider and plan around the linkages between reviewers, primary researchers, and funders when disseminating results, and to involve interest holders and translating those results into practice. 9th, key themes emerge around sustaining systematic reviews centered on racial health equity. They noted resources requiring allocation or reallocation include time, money, and human resources to ensure that projects are viable for as long as needed to meet meaningful racial health equity objectives, and noted that building in sufficient project infrastructure and ensuring interest holder buy-in can help prevent premature sunsetting or fad projects. 10th, themes emerged around changes to reporting standards for systematic reviews, with interest holders emphasizing a need for standards to be created around how to report racial health equity in reviews. Some interest holders suggested weaving racial health equity into each section of a systematic review. In the next bubble, you'll see interest holders noted that some indicators of successfully centering racial health equity in reviews would be influencing the production of robust evidence, having primary research on racial health equity be funded, engaging community representatives in the systematic review process, and the inclusion of racial health equity frameworks in reviews. And then lastly, themes emerged around challenges to systematic reviews. Interest holders emphasized that systematic reviews can only be good as the data that is available. And so participants cited a need for more robust primary data that addresses racial health equity, and a need for evidence to conceptualize race in a way that contextualizes the findings. Next slide, please. So this qualitative exploration of interest holder perspectives just helps to contextualize our understanding of current practices, gaps in methodological guidance, and future research directions for centering racial health equity in systematic reviews. The findings from this qualitative exploration demonstrates clear support for centering racial health equity in reviews, with recommendations to really change the systematic review process from top to bottom. Now I'll pass it over to Patricia to discuss findings from their evaluation of current racial health equity terms and definitions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rania. What a beautiful presentation. So I'm going to do an overview of our procedures and methodology, and then I'm going to present one of the sub-projects that is related to definitions. So next slide. So we use standard systematic review procedures, and our team uses a team science approach in developing the protocols. So we all participated and engaged in the protocols development from all the different sub-projects. We also engage our interest holders in the protocols, and they also review and gave us feedback and directions for improvement. Our protocols are published at the Open Science Framework, where we have the links available at the end of this presentation. For the searches, we use Medline, Cochrane, and Campbell databases, and we limit our searches from January 2020 to January 2023. Some specific reviews in our series also conducted separate and supplementary searches. We also target gray literature and some reference list. So our screening a priori criteria had an extraction by 2 independent reviewers per our protocol. We also use 2 reviewers to conduct quality assessments. Our methods were guided by PRISMA Guideline, PRISMA Checklist, PRISMA Equity Checklist as well, and we also use AMSTAR2 for the risk of bias and prior checklist. Next. So here we have a good illustration of the process, and we can see that our population target were the synthesis reviews that we were doing the search. So for interventions, we were restricted to not restricted to only individuals, but also including papers that addressed individuals from racial, coming from community systems, from other structural levels, and specific addressing racial health equity. So the synthesis had to have a health outcome. They were applicable to the US healthcare system. For the synthesis methods, we were very broad. We included all kinds of reviews, from scoping reviews, mapping reviews, rapid reviews, umbrella, and so forth. And our papers were limited to English. Next. So we started with 7,584 papers, and after all the criteria for inclusion exclusion, we ended up with 157 syntheses address interventions with the focus on racial health equity. The same 157 syntheses, they encompass most of the sub-projects. So all our projects were evaluating those papers with the different aims of each of the project that you're going to be seeing in the next presentations. Next one. Okay, so now I'm going to be presenting the definition project and some of the rationale for why definitions are important. So there has been, as Tiffany mentioned, there has been a growing interest in racial health equity research, and especially with the current events, we have been seeing a spike in the number of publications as well. Next slide. So this brought us to also develop an interest how people name and how people use and identify those definitions within the literature. Sometimes those definitions can be unclear and confusing. And it's important to have clear definitions and how we name those complex concepts to promote unity, transparency, common understanding among key parties, and provide better ways for us to measure success and solve those issues. So evaluating and understanding current definitions will help us guide best healthcare practices as well. So to assist with this goal, we developed 3 sub-projects designed to evaluate definitions. One project was evaluating how the original theoretical conceptual papers were defining and were publishing those definitions. We also look for key public health websites to see how they inform those definitions and how they express the context to the public. And project 3 is to systematically review racial health equity from the 157 included systematic reviews. Next. So we use a standard systematic procedure. We started with 1,816 papers, and we ended up with 34 papers that had some of the concepts of the definitions and the terminology. We also collected the citation used to define the definitions. We conducted thematic analysis and also natural language processing analysis specific to sentiment analysis to see how those definitions are into the context presented in the literature, if they have more of a positive, negative, or neutral opinion. And from these 34 papers, 16 papers had a clear definition. Next. So the 16 papers were published from 2006 to 2020. So the themes used for the definitions varied. Racism was the most common one, between 10 of the papers included. 9 articles define race as a social construct. 7 did not define race at all. 13 definitions have citations, and most cited article was the IOM, the 2003 Unequal Treatment. 14 definitions resulted in a negative sentiment analysis, which is a method that I just explained to evaluate how the context of those definitions were used in the paper. Next. So with the public health websites project, we evaluated 71 websites that were relevant to our healthcare system to US. We developed a project-specific tool to evaluate the findability of the information, so to see how intuitive and easy it was to find the definitions. We also rated the websites in terms of how long it takes and where into the website the definition was informed. Only 5 websites had a clear definition of racial health equity. 3 out of the 5 definitions had a neutral sentiment, while 2 of the definitions had a positive sentiment. Most of the definitions in the websites, they lacked supporting citations. Next. So for our project 3, we're evaluating the 157 systematic reviews identified by our group, and also evaluating how the definitions are cited, how they are announced into the actually, we're going to go to the next one for time being. Okay, so this is for the project 3, an overview. The project 3 is to evaluate our 157 systematic reviews and identify the types of definitions in terms of the terms that they use. We're also going to be doing thematic and sentiment analysis. We are still in progress. We collected more than 50% of the definitions into the papers. Also, we extracted different context of the definitions in terms of the variations that sometimes they use inequity, equity, plural forms, as well as health disparity. At this point, most of the systematic reviews included did not contain any racial health equity specific definition. And next one. In terms of conclusion, what we are learning from these 3 sub-projects is that racial health equity definitions are not clearly described, and they don't have supportive citations. We also learned that in terms of when we are explaining to the public and using websites to inform the public about those complex information, we should guide the websites for findability and easy access to the information. Racial health equity is an emergent concept, and there is not a widely accepted definition. So current themes in the definitions vary. So some use the impact of racism on health outcomes, the role of social determinants of health. Some addresses healthcare access and quality for our racial groups. Some address human dignity in the healthcare context, and also the pursuit of justice in health disparity. Nevertheless, future research needs to explore how different cultures and ethnicities interpret and define racial health equity, including in a global context. And now I'm going to hand over for our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for a wonderful experience of sharing your work. My name is Damien, and I'll be sharing with you some of our findings from the use of logic models and frameworks for methodological conduct and interest-holder engagement, particularly in systematic review of health interventions addressing racial health equity. Next slide. So systematic reviews have become commonplace in informing policy and practice in health. And logic models in particular, which were introduced in the 1970s, primarily to outline the theory of change or the program outline. And so in this paper, what we're looking at is considering the logic model as a graphic way to organize and think conceptually through the review process. If you go on to the next, my other transitions is coming. I want that other big block. Thank you very much, Mira. So in thinking about the systematic review and thinking about interest holder engagement, This is also important because we understand that frameworks are the overall structure that outlines for us the approach and the theoretical underpinnings that guide the process of engagement. In this case, we're specifically looking at how we can integrate the voices, experience, and expertise of those involved or impacted by health disparities. In this case, again, we're looking specific to racialized populations. Next slide. In our work, we addressed two key questions in the synthesis. The first one being what logic models and frameworks exist for methods and interest holder engagement in evidence synthesis addressing racial health inequities. And key question number two, how can logic models and frameworks be used to guide the methodological conduct of systematic reviews and engage in interest holder engagement in evidence syntheses addressing racial health inequities. For key question number one, we looked at guidance and the use of logic models and synthesized that by the type and potential use across 6 dimensions that were adapted from Neal and Harris. We also considered framework and the guidance around framework for interest holder engagement, and this was guided by a precision medicine conceptual framework for engagement. For key question 2, we explored overarching health equity frameworks for guidance on use of logic models and interest holder engagement frameworks in evidence syntheses addressing racial health equity. Next slide. In the next 2 slides, I'll share with you our key findings. We found that 2 of the 157 syntheses included in our study used or included a logic model or conceptual framework related to methodological conduct. None of these syntheses explicitly reported on a framework for interest holder engagement. However, some of them do report an aspect of engagement, which my colleague Neela will share in her work. In 2 of the reviews that reported on logic model or conceptual framework, the authors primarily use logic model to define and inform the mechanism of the intervention. So the other 5 steps that we are using to outline the logic model approach in reviews were not utilized. In this next slide, we also considered guidance on the use of logic models and interest holder engagement from existing health equity frameworks. The slides are seemingly going ahead of me. So if you go back to my health equity framework, thank you very much. So in this slide, we're considering guidance on the use of logic models and interest holder engagement from existing health equity frameworks. And in our paper, we included 6 of these, and by no means an exhaustive list, but these were identified from our listening exercises that was led by Rani and presented earlier. These frameworks included the NIA, National Institute of Aging Health Disparities Framework, the NIMHD model, the Williams and Mohammed Framework on Racism and Health, the AHRQ Digital Health Equity Guide, the REAP Framework for Health Policy, and the USPSTF Health Equity Framework. We found that 2 of these 6 health equity frameworks included guidance on the use of logic models, particularly looking at race and racism and how that influences health, and 1 other looking on system-based models for addressing racial health equity. All 6 of the health equity frameworks addressed race and racism, but provided little guidance on the use of logic models and/or interest holder engagement framework for centering racial health equity in evidence syntheses. Next slide. So the key implications that emerge from this work suggest that research in evidence synthesis methods should pilot equity-focused logic models, explanatory models, and/or other conceptual framework for centering racial health equity in evidence syntheses. There is also a need for developing framework for interest holder engagement in evidence syntheses and guidance on interest holder engagement in existing health equity frameworks. And I'll now hand over to our next presenter. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Damien. Always love how visual you can be in your presentations, especially with the logic models. So thanks, you inspire us. I'm going to describe a review of methods and interventions. Next slide, please. So we had two key questions for this review. We wanted to look at what types of methods are used to evaluate effects on racial health inequities in systematic reviews. And the second question, we wanted to look at what types of interventions have been used. For the first question, we used the Cochrane Handbook to categorize types of methods used. And for the second question, we used a framework by Williams and Cooper that has 3 levels: communities of opportunity. This includes things like enhancing income, providing employment or housing, improving health systems or health care, and the third, building political will. And we chose this framework because it was specifically focused on reducing racial inequities and taking action on racial inequities. Next slide, please. So realize we haven't described the sample of 157 reviews that we identified. So this is a very brief overview. Almost more than half of the reviews were systematic reviews, and a quarter were scoping reviews. The rest were overviews and other kinds of reviews. The topic was mostly general health, not specific to any condition, but you can see that there were quite large numbers of reviews that were focused on specific conditions: reproductive health, endocrine, mental health, and cancer. In terms of interventions, we identified there's roughly a quarter focused on educational types of interventions, a quarter on care delivery, a quarter on behavioral. And in terms of population, I think quite interesting, about 44% of these reviews focused on racial minorities unspecified, and a quarter focus on Indigenous populations, a quarter focus on Black populations, and 13% Latinx. Next slide, please. And in terms of the quality, we used a tool called the MSTAR2 that Patricia already mentioned to assess the methodological quality. And we found that only 2 reviews were rated high quality. Almost all were low or critically low, mostly due to inadequate assessment of risk of bias, failure to describe the excluded studies, and failure to look at heterogeneity. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a new visual form inspired by Damien. It's a heat map which shows the number of interventions, a number of reviews for each type of intervention. And we've expanded the types of interventions from the Williams framework into subcategories here. So what you can see centered in the middle of this heat map is that most of the reviews had a focus on building more health into delivery of care. And the type of interventions there are addressing health disparities. One example was addressing health disparities for African American men with prostate cancer, or culturally safe interventions in primary care for management of chronic diseases in Indigenous people. So these are tailoring healthcare to meet specific racialized populations. And then you can also see that there are very few reviews in the top category, creating communities of opportunity, and few reviews in the bottom category. In the first category, communities of opportunity, these are interventions like food policy actions or structural interventions that affect racial inequities. And in the bottom category, raising political will or raising awareness, one example of a review is a review that looked at tools to measure the impact of structural racism on gastrointestinal disease outcomes. So these are more structural focused reviews. Next slide, please. So in terms of methods, as this was one of our key questions, we found that 10% of these reviews used meta-analysis and 10% used qualitative methods. 20% described effect estimates for individual studies, most likely due to very different types of interventions and outcomes. that would need further analysis. And on the sort of next level, there were a number of reviews that used vote counting, and 46% of reviews described results as positive or negative for individual studies. And these methods may be more at risk of being misleading because they don't take into account the confidence interval around the effect sizes. Next slide, please. So key implications for our review, I think in terms of interventions, it's clear most of the focus is tailoring healthcare to improve access or uptake with very little focus on broader structural interventions. In terms of methods, I think we've identified in alignment with the listening exercise that there may be a need for better reporting standards and methodological guidance to support reviews addressing racial health inequities. And and I think also in alignment with the listening exercise, these reviews were of low methodological quality, and more standards and guidance could help improve this. And I'll pass over to Neela. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Neela Sate from RTI, and I'm going to present on our review of syntheses and guidance documents addressing interest holder engagement. Next. So we addressed two key questions in this review. First, we used that set of 157 syntheses that Vivian just described to examine if and how they reported using interest holder engagement in the conduct of the review. And our second key question, we examine the extent to which methods documents provide guidance for engaging diverse individuals in syntheses. For this key question, we conducted searches for published methods or guidance materials, and we conducted targeted gray literature searches and searches of websites and websites of relevant organizations. Next. So for the first key question, we found that 29 of the 157 syntheses reported engaging participants in the conduct of the review. These were typically systematic or scoping reviews. They were often funded by non-US government agencies, and they often engaged individuals from minoritized populations, including Indigenous or First Nations populations. Next. And we found that syntheses often reported when or the phase in which participants were engaged, and this was typically early or later phases. They typically reported less explicit detail about why participants were engaged or the rationale for using engagement, or participants' own rationale for engaging in the conduct of the review. And they often reported limited detail on the pragmatics of how to do engagement. So this could be if engagement was conducted virtually or in person, or how individuals were recruited. And finally, syntheses reported very little detail about the resources needed to do engagement, things like time, training needs, and minimal detail about the outcomes of engagement. The information that we collected about outcomes came from our follow-up contacts with authors, and the outcomes were typically related to changes in the review focus or adding or clarifying the outcomes that were addressed in the review itself. Next slide. For our second key question, we found no guidance documents that explicitly addressed engaging diverse interest holders in syntheses. 4 documents did touch on broader equity considerations related to engaging people in syntheses, and this typically addressed training or the importance of incorporating lived experience. We also collected a broader set of documents that we considered highly salient for informing diverse engagement. This included methods documents related to engaging in guidelines development or in health research in general, and this could be things like reporting guidelines or methods manuals. Next. So key takeaways of this work include that in the set of syntheses we examined, which again addressed the topic area of mitigating racial health and equity, and which would seem fruitful for using engagement, there was limited detail reported to inform really practical considerations about how to engage diverse populations in this work and to understand the outcomes of engagement. Indigenous-led reviews typically had more detail, But overall, we need more information about where and how engagement can make a difference and where best to direct resources to optimize reviews for the populations that they address. Next. And similarly, the guidance about how to engage racially and ethnically diverse interest holders in syntheses specifically is lacking, but there is a large body of related guidance that offers a foundation to build on and that can potentially be augmented with considerations for engaging specific populations. So I'll turn it over to Mira to talk about next steps.
Thanks, Neela. That was really wonderful. I just wanted to recap for you all what we heard. So from Tiffany, you heard a little bit about the context and the urgency with which we approached this problem. You know, it felt like a really important problem to address. From Rania, you heard about the pretty consistent commitment to addressing racial health equity and a hunger for guidance and the practical how-to of it. And then you heard from Patricia that there isn't a consistent, commonly understood definition of racial health equity. From Damien, you heard about the lack of logic models and frameworks. And from Vivian, you heard about the limited attention to structural interventions to address racial health equity and the poor methodological standards by which these reviews are being done. And lastly, you heard from Neela about, from Rania, we heard about the importance of engaging interest holders. And from Neela, you heard how limited that engagement is and how limited the guidance is. So the next steps, you may ask, what are the next steps? And so we wanted to understand what the interest is in this topic, what the state of the science is, which is what these 4 systematic reviews did, and then what we should do next, what the prioritization should be. And we realized pretty early on that a really key element of trying to advance this work is to disseminate our results. So we thank you for this opportunity to come and talk to you. This is really an important part of making the case for why this matters. We've also, as Tiffany said in the very beginning, we've got a series of papers now under review with the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and we'll continue to disseminate our results. As part of that last exercise, which Tiffany mentioned around prioritization, we had initially intended it for it to be a smaller exercise, but we have been very lucky in getting a meeting co-sponsored by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and AHRQ, and that summit will be held on June 26, 2024. Some of you may have already received invitations. It is an invitation-only meeting, so if you're interested, you think you have either relevant experience or, please email us and we can see if we can work in an invitation. We're really interested in expanding our collaborator network for the next round of work. That's another thing if you're interested in or you have what you think is an ongoing experiment. So in terms of so this is the very short-term list of activities we're engaged in. Over the long term, we think of this as a wheel that's been set in motion by others working in this field, the USB STF, our work, many of you are already doing this as well. So this wheel is in motion, but it has to be advanced. And in order to do so, all these other gears have to move alongside. So yes, we see this from all the insights we've gathered so far. We see this as changing really the entire evidence ecosystem. If you want to advance racial health equity in the United States, you need to identify and prioritize issues that need new evidence. You need to generate new evidence that incorporates and adequately represents minoritized communities. You need to synthesize it, identify solutions, and identify gaps in knowledge that then require further research. But all of this requires establishing foundational guides, building substantive evidence base, strengthening methodological guidance, disseminating and implementing results, and sustaining new practices through funding, training, and new standards. And finally, none of this is going to make any difference. All the work we do for systematic reviews or clinical practice guidelines, all of that work is meaningless if we don't increase representation in the research itself and in research themes. So before we turn over to questions, I wanted to ask you all, because these are questions we're struggling with for this summit in summer, as we open the floor for discussions. I wanted to ask you whether you've been struggling with this issue, what kinds of metrics you've thought about in measuring whether or not the clinical practice guidelines that you're generating center racial health equity. How do you know you've succeeded in actually centering racial health equity? Have you struggled with scoping racial health equity in reviews? How have you done so? And are there best practices? Do you have exemplars for what might work best? And do you have thoughts about how one can implement guidelines to ensure racial health equity? So we have, as you can tell, an infinity of questions. We have a big, huge array of tasks to do next, for which we really seek collaborators. This work cannot be done by a small subset of people. It really requires the engagement of a community. So we look forward to hearing from you all and hopefully engaging you all in the next round of work. I'll stop there and turn it over to Dina to manage questions.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Mira. Please remember to post your questions in the Q&A section. This is a topic, as you heard Mira said, she would really like to have feedback on. To kick us off, I have one question, and that is, why focus on race? Are there not many marginalized groups, especially here in the U.S., where we have such a varied communities and different social determinants of health? Why are we focusing on race?
So I'll take that, if that's okay, Dina. And this is a question, as we've done our presentations to other communities, especially actually Cochrane, the global Cochrane audience, this has come up. And I think it's a twofold response. One is that we're working within the context of the US network, and really in the US, racial differences drive a lot of the disparities you see in health. And so that's really critical for us to address. And the second is that focusing on race does not preclude us from looking at other really important intersectional issues. And that is part of the work that Patricia hopes to advance in the next round of definitional work, is for us to consider those intersectional issues as well.
Okay, we also have a participant who is asking for you to share your work, the citations that you published in JCE.
Yeah, we've just submitted those. They're under review. We will have preprints available in SSRM. I don't know what that expands to exactly, but as soon as we have that available, we'll send that for you to post, Dina, along with the video of this presentation.
Okay. Let me see if there are other questions. Okay, so one other question. We know that, systematic reviews are what feeds into our guidelines. So what is the value added? I think you all are very entrenched in the world of systematic evidence review. So what is the value added of centering racial equity in systematic reviews?
Well, I'll take a pass at that, and then I look forward to hearing from my colleagues as well. I think one of the things we've seen, especially from the work on algorithmic bias, is that not centering racial health equity can cause harm. And what we've discovered from reviews that we've done is that not only does it cause harm to minoritized communities, focusing on race as biology actually harms other populations as well, because you may overtreat or overemphasize particular aspects of care and ignore other communities that require, for whom you may not perceive risk factors because you're conflating race with biology. Did anyone have anything else to add? There's a question for Damon.
Yes. So, yes. Damien, can you see the question? I am so this person's question is for Damien. They're interested to know what framework did you use for key questions one that you shared in your slide today?
All right, great. Thank you for that question. I think it's Kieran. We use the Neal and Harris paper that outlines the implications or the methods guidance around use of logic model in systematic review. I can share that link with you in the chat in a little while. But what it outlines is across 6 dimensions of the review, starting out with just how you scope that question all the way through to the dissemination of the results. Just how might the logic model be useful in guiding that process? The paper also goes into outlining how the logic model can be used, especially in defining the intervention and the theory of change behind an intervention and how that might impact your distal outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Hello, I apologize for that. I had a bit of technical difficulty. My mic was frozen for a bit. So remember all to please post your questions in the Q&A if there are any more. What do you have any more information you would like to share about the summit you mentioned coming up in June, the objectives or how we can engage further? For those of us, especially for those who may not be invited.
Yeah, so I think Jennifer Lynn is also on this call, so I'll invite her to add to anything that I might have to say. But we are really looking to advance the work on centering racial health equity, and a key component of it is to understand what the measures of success might be and prioritize next steps for action. And we are seeking to engage those who have either done some important work on this or are on the process of doing so. And we want to understand what might be best practices, help collate some of that, understand where to prioritize next steps. Because the reality is that all of us are working with limited time and resources. So we want to work on the issues and the practices that make the most difference as quickly as possible. Jen, I don't know if you had anything to contribute there.
Dina, there are new questions posted in the Q&A.
I'm sorry, I cannot see them. I'm having some technical difficulties. Please go ahead and post them. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, I am going to read them. Mira and company, I'm not sure if you're also able to see them, but I'll start reading them. There's one from Dr. Shazia Sadiq. In the algorithm space, a lot of work has been done to understand the potential for algorithms to directly contribute to disparities, and then specific mitigation strategies have been proposed to target sources of disparities, i.e. the use of proxy variables. For guidelines, it seems that we need to better understand the effect of guidelines on racial and ethnic disparities to determine specific mitigation strategies. Are there efforts to study the current effect of systematic reviews and guidelines on disparities?
So thanks, Shazia, for the question. I have not seen these kinds of reviews, but I have read case studies. So I think that is work that is ripe to be done to compile these instances in order to make the case for why this is important.
And I think the question from Helen Wu is sort of in alignment. As a guideline developer, I'd be interested in seeing more research that evaluates how disparities and outcomes change if race-aware recommendations are removed from guidelines. We know that race-based medicine is problematic. However, we don't know whether removing race-aware recommendations increases or decreases disparities?
And we completely agree with you, Helen. And we think that understanding the impact of these things takes time and resources. And we need to build ongoing evaluation to any changes in our processes.
I also had a question in there for Vivian. I was wondering if you could comment about progress in this arena in Canada.
That's an interesting question. Thanks. The review was global, so we looked for systematic reviews in any high-income country. We didn't actually pull out which countries to compare, progress or methods or interventions across different countries.
No, I
Thanks.
think my intent was sort of what efforts are underway in Canada. I know that Canada is a few steps ahead of the US in this regard in acknowledging sort of past history and racial injustice. So I'm wondering, in this space for health equity and guidelines and systematic reviews, is there other work being conducted?
So there, I mean, okay, let's stick with the methods space. So there is some work on incorporating equity into guideline development, not systematic reviews, which the Cochrane and Campbell Equity Thematic Group is involved in, and also the GRADE group at McMaster University. So there are other initiatives about incorporating equity into guideline development. Into systematic reviews, again, the Cochrane and Campbell Equity Methods Group is a global group, not a Canadian group. Although the co-convener, Peter Tugwell, is based in Canada, has a group of 8 global conveners, of which Damien Francis on this call is one. And that group is looking at equity in collaboration with this group, looking at developing guidance on health equity broadly, not just racial health equity in systematic reviews. And as you might know, our group developed an extension for the PRISMA statement, the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, to look at equity-focused reviews. That was last done in 2012. And that guidance actually, when we look at it now, seems quite out of date. Doesn't discuss some of the things that our group assessed about engaging with interest holders, for example, and doesn't, I think, engage enough with some of the framework and logic model description that Damien has described. So one of the things our group has discussed is updating that guidance for reporting systematic reviews.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question from Elisa Haskell, and she says, this is such a difficult topic for guidelines to address that many avoid it. Also, this is not something that methodologists, clinicians have encountered in their training. Comments, I think, are you aware of any sort of planned training activities related to what's in discussion today?
Well, I think there's a 2-part response to that. I'll give one response and I'll suggest Patricia offer the second response, which is the first part of it about it being a difficult topic to address. I think one of the key things that we need to make is the case for why this matters and why it's counterproductive to avoid mentioning it. And we will do that as part of our next exercise, is to formally lay out the case for why it's important to address and how it cannot be avoided. Regarding the training issue, Patricia had an idea for the next round of funding. Did you want to mention that briefly, Patricia?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I was very excited with that question. And I would say so our team meets weekly and we are always brainstorming and reevaluating our own work. And some of the discussions was about how this knowledge is translating to training. And when we think about healthcare force training, preparedness, is that being included in the curriculum? When in the curriculum? If all the institutions are already incorporating? So we know very little about that, and definitely we are interested in pursuing more knowledge to understand and be able to inform. So that's so critical as we think about the next generation of healthcare professionals. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Great. Thank you. Any others want to comment?
I thought maybe Rania might want to comment, but I can comment too on the listening exercises that we did. We had a question specifically about training, and we did get a lot of input about that, about who should be trained and why they should be trained, and who even realizes that they need training and who's giving the training. So I don't know, Rania, if you want to talk more about that, but it's definitely something that has come up various times and could go a number of different routes, I think.
Yeah, no, it was definitely touched on heavily when we were doing the listening exercises. People had a lot of different ideas, but overall, there was definitely a consensus that training was needed at all levels. Some people were saying, they prefer training to be incorporated throughout systematic reviews, so not just having a standalone racial health equity training, but really incorporating it into the research processes. That was one suggestion. Having training from the very beginning. So in schooling, before people even engage in research, that was another idea. Having institutions like, Cochrane, Campbell, having trainings that are available that are racial health equity specific, but then also incorporating it into, like I said, the research processes. So there was a lot of mention of training, but there was definitely consensus that more training was needed.
Yeah, and I also jump in here and say I think the deficit of training is made even greater when there is a lack of guidance. So, for example, a lack of guidance as it relates to framework for engagement. As Neela pointed out, there is some engagement that is happening, but hardly sufficient. And then the logic models. And so you have two problems here. You have a lack of clear guidance and clear definitions, and then you have a lack or deficit in training. And so I think, to add on or to fix the training issue, you first need to establish these guidance, then train. And those who you train or those who are coming on to the systematic review or the evidence synthesis arena will then have those guidance to kind of follow through and use those guidance, certainly.
Thank you. I think a follow-up question to this would be, despite the lack of guidance at this time, how can this audience, those who are here today, who have continually shown interest in being engaged, how can they remain engaged at this time with what's available for us now?
So I did have a slide with my email address, but I don't think it's not like you can click on it. But after the fact, please feel free to write to any one of us. I'm here to convene and gather those suggestions. We will be part of what this exercise in June, the summit, is to gather people who are interested in it and to work collaboratively on next steps. As we're working on these, we're gathering all the best practices we can, and we'll make them available, as quickly as we can, because we recognize the importance of identifying exemplars and disseminating them widely. I did notice one question in the Q&A, which I don't think we got to, about whose responsibility it is.
Yes.
That's such a great question. And
Let's address that.
Yeah, and it's a really important question to address, and one that we've actually gotten a lot of, as I said in my bit of the presentation, we heard that none of this is going to matter if you can't change the underlying evidence. So yes, the responsibility lies with both reviewers and primary researchers, but I wanted to turn it over to Vivian, who could speak perhaps to a new way of addressing this problem, and maybe a universal set of guidance.
Okay, thanks, Mira. So I think, yeah, it's a great question because we started this work like 10 years ago when we developed the extension for PRISMA, focus on equity, and we followed that up with an extension for randomized trials that focus on equity. And what Mira and Damien, Patricia, Tiffany, everyone here we've been talking about is maybe it would be helpful to have a single guidance that goes across types of studies and reflects on fairness and anti-racism across these types of the primary studies, the systematic reviews, and even the guidelines. So have a lens that goes across studies. And that's something we'd like to work towards in the future. So thanks, Mira.
And since you're responding, do you want to also address the issue around participation by racialized groups in clinical trials?
Sure. I didn't see that
it's
question.
There are efforts to increase participation.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things we've focused on in this study was describing how the populations are described, so representation. And that's another issue that we found was a bit lacking in our 2012 PRISMA extension. But there's a group led by Sean Treweek in the UK that's developed the Include framework for including racialized groups in clinical trials. And I'm also working with Bianca Bernath in Australia, who's leading an initiative to develop guidance on inclusion of racialized groups in clinical trials. So there are different initiatives to bring that into trials for sure, and it would definitely be part of any future guidance for reviews as well, describing the representation. One of the things we've done for guidelines that was led by one of our team, Omar Duadar, is looking at how you can describe representation using something called the participant prevalence ratio to describe how the population in the studies is in comparison to the people who have the condition of interest or the problem of interest. So it looks at representation in the context of where the evidence will be applied.
And I just want to note that one of the attendees has posted an article by Omar, the self-same Omar, in the Q&A. There's another question that Gerardo posted from an attendee about the value added by centering racial health equity in systematic reviews and guidance. I think we've addressed this partially, but I did want to bring up our perspective, which is that this is as much about, yes, one can think of this as an issue that justice and fairness requires, but there's also another lens, which is harm reduction. And part of this is about reducing harms that occur when you don't center racial health equity. And these harms are not specific to or limited to racialized populations. Those harms actually extend to the entire population.
Great, thank you. I think that's the end of the submitted questions. For our panelists, if there is anything that you would like to address further, any sort of thoughts that came to you reviewing the entirety of the questions submitted, please feel free. We have some time left. Please feel free to share. If not, we'll turn it over to Dina.
Hi, everyone.
I
actually, if we have gone through all the participant questions, I actually have one more question, and I think it may be for Neela, since your presentation focused more on stakeholders. We try to include stakeholders in the guideline development side, but that is, in terms of developing recommendations and getting feedback. How feasible do you think it is to involve stakeholders in evidence synthesis based on what you have done so far? Because it's very difficult to involve stakeholders in the guideline development process. So I'm wondering, how feasible it is on the for the evidence synthesis side.
Yeah, and I apologize. I had to turn off my camera because my video keeps, I'm getting messages that my connection is unstable, but thank you for the question.
No problem. I'm having technical difficulties myself. Thank you.
It's a good question, and that was one of the things we were hoping to see reported more explicitly in this set of syntheses that we looked at, to inform exactly that question of if we do want to make this change to the evidence ecosystem, what does it really take? And I would say, I think it's feasible. We're certainly trying to do this with some reviews that we're engaged in, but it obviously does require commitment on the part of the funders and commitment on the part of the review team and a real intentionality in the process. Because one of the things that we haven't probably fully explored, or at least is not reported yet in the literature, is what do you do if the recommendations you're getting from stakeholders are opposite to what funders might be wanting you to look at? Or if there are sort of contentious discussions about what should be looked at, how do we resolve those conflicts and remain true to what the review needs to accomplish, what the interest holders' desires are, what the review team needs to do? So it's an open question, I would say. I think it is feasible, but we need to understand more. What does that actually mean in terms of resources, and how do we address some of these underlying questions of kind of how to balance the power dynamics, how to ensure that all voices are represented? So I'm not giving you a very pat answer. In line with all systematic reviews, we need more evidence.
I see there's a handful of questions. Christine had asked about the participant ratio tool. So Vivian, perhaps you can post that in the chat.
I think she posted
Oh,
that.
yes. Also, there is, there are a few there are requests in the chat for publication on patient engagements and stakeholders too. Those are very sparse.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when we post when we post our Neela's paper, we'll have some of those citations. And when we post, when we're able to share our preprints, you can have those citations. I think there was one more question in the Q&A. Oh, heavens, this is a difficult one. What do you all as panelists feel is the most difficult challenge of this topic? Equity, evidence synthesis, and guideline development. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and see what they have to say.
Can you read the question again, Mira? I can't access the Q&A box for some reason.
What do you all as panelists feel is the most difficult challenge of this topic? Equity, and then in parentheses, equity, evidence synthesis, and guideline development. I mean, part of the reason why I'm hesitant to respond is because I feel like they're all equally difficult, but
for different reasons. Yeah.
So Vivian has an answer. Yay.
I don't know if you're asking us to choose amongst those three, but I think one of the big challenges that we're facing when we think about equity is intersectionality and how different characteristics interact. And I think that's, and also with the context that people live in. And that's something all of us encountered in doing this review, I think. So going forward, and I think it really comes out in Patricia's definitions paper. When the SSRN links are up, you'll be able to read it. But it's definitely a nice question. Thanks.
So one that we hope in the future we will have more data to answer more effectively or to respond to more effectively. I think that just goes to show how nuanced and just new this field is, and the room that there is for growth.
There are 2 more questions that came in. I think we have time to at least tackle one.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering if Patricia wanted to address the equity versus equality question.
Sure, let's see if I can. This is one of the no comments.
Yeah, it's can you comment on the emphasis on equity over equality and how the work presented today in evidence synthesis internalizes this?
Yeah, and that is such a great question, because they are so used interchangeably. So you really have to look into the context. So sometimes they mean the same, depending of the type of work. And so there's so much dissection, and that's why I really like trying to better define and come up with some guidance and how one put those concepts together. So if we think about racism, one concept, and then when we add equity to it, now we are talking about a new concept, a new way to name and inform. So you just start to get more complex and convoluted, and that's why having an agreement in the usage and applications and the way that we define and name things is so critical.
And from the perspective of this project, we really did start with that, that sort of a classical definition of equity, helping people where they are, rather than trying to bring people up, offering people more resources if they need more resources, so that you can get people to a more equitable place, rather than offering everybody the same resources. There was one question about any specific tool to evaluate risk of bias in equity-related studies. I think my answer is no. I'm not aware of any, but maybe, I don't know, Vivian or somebody else wants to comment.
Well, I could just say that in the listening exercise, Mira, you had the really interesting feedback that would it be considered a risk of bias if a study or a review didn't consider the representation of the population? But I'm not aware of anybody who's developed that tool. But is a really great question. I'm not aware of any specific risk of bias tool. One thing we brainstormed about with Sean Treweek, who's working on a table of characteristics of the populations included in reviews that will inform Cochrane's guidance. He's calling that initiative Pro EDI. There's actually a tool you can try if you're interested in it. He said, wouldn't this be kind of interesting if we could make a visual display of the representation of people in the studies, almost like the risk of bias tool has a sort of green, red, yellow. Anyway, so there's lots of work to be done. Thanks for the question.
So I've added Sean's from the Cochrane methods link into the chat if anyone wants to take a look at that. From an EPI perspective, when you think about a tool to examine risk of bias, you're really looking on methodological quality of the conduct. And when you think about composition of those involved in the studies, it's the larger issue of representation and generalizability. Can we then generalize the findings of these work to include in guidelines that address the population that was not a part of this work? And so it's really important that we consider it. I'm not sure, though, how it affects the methods of the review, but certainly it is an extension piece that must be considered if we are going to develop guidelines to address all groups, all racial groups, given the lack of inclusion of some of these racial groups in the actual process of conducting the review, or even being participant in the research itself.
Great, thank you. So we are at the end of our allotted time. If there are no more questions, we would like to thank our speakers for participating today. This has been a very informative and rich discussion. Please note that we are scheduled to have part 3 in this series on March 15th. You should see an announcement from Gin Connect in the coming days. I'm sorry, on March 15th, not June, I apologize, on March 15th. There will be part 3 in the series, so please look out for that on Gin Connect, and we hope you would register and be back with us for a continued engagement on this topic. Thank you all so much for participating. If you would like to review this session again or share it with someone who was not able to participate live today, it will be available. The recording will be available in about a week on the GIN YouTube channel.